Welcome, students. My name is Silke Beck. I'm Senior Research Scientist at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research at Leipzig. Lecture 9 is dealing with scientific advice to policy. In episode 1, I will discuss what role scientific advisors, or experts in short, can play in order to promote the transformation to the low-carbon society. In episode 2, Dr. Inge Paulini will sketch how the German Advisory Council for Global Change, the WBGU in short, works. In the third part, we will have an interview which will address open questions. What are the learning outcomes of this lecture? The German Advisory Council for Global Change calls for a new contract between science and society. The Council also claims that transformative policymaking must be accompanied by systematic scientific advice. This sounds good, but what does it mean? This talk tries to take up this topic by addressing questions as follows. What role or roles can experts perform within the new contract between science and society? How can scientific advice make a valuable contribution to policy making? The talk asks what lessons can be learned from former experiences. The talk is based on case studies made on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC in short, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and also German advisory bodies such as the Enquete Commission linked to the German Parliament. How do I proceed in this talk? First, I will set out the particular problem we try to address. Second, I will outline models of scientific expertise. Third, I will discuss the underlying assumptions and show their implications for evaluating the role of expertise. Last but not least, I will conclude with a discussion on how experts can support transformative policy making. Generally speaking, scientific experts can take over a variety of roles in relationship to policy. I guess you will see this in the talk of Dr. Paulini later on. But I want to draw your attention to one particular challenge that is related to the grand transformation. International events such as the Rio+20 conference in 2012 highlight the very fact that science is being asked to be relevant. That means that experts are not only called to define what the problem with climate change, biodiversity, food security, and so on is, but they are also asked to provide answers or contribute to provide solutions to address these challenges. In other words, there is a growing demand for usable information for decision-making on the ground. But can we take the usability of knowledge for granted? Is the usability of this knowledge given? To provide you just one example, while the IPCC was quite instrumental in raising public and political awareness for global warming, the knowledge produced by the IPCC and other high-level, high-quality programs, this knowledge is seen as politically relevant but not directly usable for decision-making at the national, regional and local level. In other words, we cannot take the usability of science or information for granted. In other words, there is a challenge to make scientific knowledge relevant and usable to decision-making. Following this line of argument, the WBGU also highlights the need to align research more closely to the needs of the transformation process. And this is the situation where experts or scientific advisors come into the picture. One of the major tasks for these expert bodies is to reconcile demand and supply for information, to phrase it in this market metaphor, or in other words, to combine and integrate political needs for information with the scientific supply in an effective and coherent way. I will come now to the analytical part. The guiding questions here are how to assess an assessment or expertise, what are the tools, models and criteria available to analyze and evaluate the science policy interactions. First of all, I'm sorry to say this, but there's nothing like the standard benchmark or the one-size-fits-all model. This would be a single approach that can be simply applied to different situations and cases such as climate change, biodiversity, food security, and last but not least, transformation policies. Our empirical findings, however, indicate that such a model does not exist. The challenges, requirements, the particular framework condition and task are very dependent on the issue at stake, the timing and the time frame, the particular political and cultural context, and last but not least, the level of decision making. The demand for information, for instance, varies according to the stage of the policy cycle. In addition, to make it even more complicated, there is no universal measure or standardized answer to the question what and why an expert body is successful or not. The outcomes of this evaluation are also very dependent on what criteria and underlying models and causal frameworks we use in order to evaluate scientific expertise. The fact, however, that the one-size model is not given or does not exist is not necessarily a problem. It also offers opportunities. So the question is, what choices do we have in order to explore and assess the role of expertise in decision making? When it comes to the relation between science and policy, what matters and what makes a difference? First of all, that's my experience. These are the assumptions about the nature of the relationship between science and politics. The question is the nature thought to be linear or interactive or recursive? Second, it matters what is the focus of our analysis and what's our point of view. What are we looking at? Are we looking at products such as reports, or are we exploring the processes and procedures and institutional arrangements that lead to this particular outcome? In other words, are we taking a look at the input side? Third, what are the respective criteria we apply and use to evaluate a science policy interface? Do we ask how instrumental is expertise in terms of problem solving? Then the criteria is efficiency. Are we taking a look on the impacts of a report on decision making, the degree of implementation of scientific advice, or the question of compliance? Do actors follow scientific advice? Then we use the criteria of effectiveness. But we can also think about the legitimacy in terms of the quality of the process. The question then is how inclusive, how transparent, how accountable, and how open are these processes and procedures. The question then is who is included and how are a participant included, and what's the quality of the deliberation processes inside these expert bodies. Last but not least, we can also ask the question how responsive and reflexive are expert bodies. Then we ask for the capacities of advisory bodies to reflect and react to novel challenges. Fourth, and I think that's also a very important issue, what matters is the tradition of politics in which these models are embedded. On the one side, there are instrumental or utilitarian approaches. They are mainly oriented to rational problem solving. It's all about setting goals, adjusting means to reach these goals, and last but not least, to measure the degree of goal achievement. On the other side of the spectrum, there are democratic approaches. They mainly focus on the question on how empower citizens and the public and how to enable different groups in order to contribute and to start decision making. I'm sure there are certainly more concepts and traditions, but I cannot go into details here and do justice to all of them. But I want to show you the extremes or the pole of the spectrum of political traditions. I guess you certainly ask yourself, in what relationship do these goals and criteria stand? These are very, very far-reaching goals and criteria, you know. You will ask, can we reach all these aims to inform solution and empower politics at pretty much the same time? Can we simultaneously meet all these criteria? Are they mutually reinforcing or are they exclusive? Are there remarkable trade-offs between scientific credibility on the one side and political relevance on the other side? Can the political relevance only be achieved at cost of the scientific qualities? These are very important questions when it comes to scientific advice. But we cannot go into details of modeling the science policy interface at this point. But as a matter of fact, we have to take into account the implications that these choices have when we explore the role of expertise in transformation governance. Let's take a look at the linear model first. Many scientists in the field of environmental policy start from the assumption that the united scientific voice will trigger or catalyze political action. As the journalist Simon Cooper puts it, once we agree what science says, policy will automatically follow. That's why the Nobel Committee awarded Al Gore and the IPCC a Peace Prize. A comparable booster or catalyzing effect is also expected to come from the next IPCC report and from the IPBES, which currently is set up. It's evident that these expectations are very high. What are the assumptions guiding the linear model? The relationship between science and policy is conceived as one-dimensional, linear, one way from science to policy. In other words, truth speaks to power. Success is here identical with influence or impact on decision-making. These models are based on the assumption that more and better knowledge on information will trigger political action and public consent. Scientific evidence is the only authority that can justify political action. In other words, policy debates will be decided by science alone. As you can see, science plays a critical role in decision-making. One of the main assumptions is that we cannot act until science is sound. In other words, first we have to get the science right, then act. Scientific consensus is the only prerequisite for action. If not only given, experts or advisors are expected to provide the consensual knowledge base for decision-making. Speaking with one single uniform voice, experts are supposed to provide the one and only or the silver bullet shot solution. In this way, science is supposed to determine policy. But as a lot of cases show, these assumptions are also very dangerous. Case studies, however, show that the linear model does not correctly describe the relationship to decision-making. The linear model proved as empirically false. There's ample evidence, even if in so-called success cases such as climate change, there is ample evidence to show that policy does not emerge in a simple and straightforward way from scientific understandings. Even if there is a remarkable degree of scientific consensus, neither politicians nor the public automatically heed expert warnings, and the policy does not follow science, and the world usually does not act. There is also little evidence of reduced or smarter consumption and other changes in terms of behavior. In other words, political action and public consent does not necessarily flow from the quality of science alone. And political action does not depend solely on the strength of scientific consensus or consensus between experts. We have also to take into account consequences of using this model for informing science policy. According to the linear model, experts are supposed to act as neutral arbiter. They have to keep politics out of policy. They have to keep, as the political scientist Peter M. Haas puts it, they have to keep problems away from the political world. But at the same time, these assumptions contribute to politicized science. While claiming to be neutral, experts anticipate and determine policy making. They are engaged in implicit and explicit policy advocacy if they compel to act people in a particular way. At the same time, the linear model also contributes to depoliticize policy. In a lot of cases, experts are very unlikely to fulfill the expectation for sound, uncontroversial scientific evidence. These idealized notions of sound, uncontroversial science make science vulnerable to controversy. According to the model, we can only act when science is sound, but if there are uncertainties and controversies, they can be used to delay action and thus contribute to political gridlock. What are the lessons learned? The equation between success and impacts or trigger have been shown to be too simplistic in empirical terms. The limitation of this model, however, have become increasingly obvious. More and better information paradoxically contribute to enhance uncertainties, controversies, and last but not least may delay decision-making rather than to contribute to rational solutions. In other words, more and better information are often part of the problem itself rather than the solution, because this approach only addresses symptoms. Problems like inaction or public mistrust, these problems are often not caused by the shortage of knowledge. As Dan Seritz puts it, if we are unable or unwilling to make wise use of existing knowledge, is there any reason to believe that new and more knowledge will succeed where the old knowledge fails? These pitfalls also point to a deeper problem, and the problem lies in the way how the question at stake is framed. One alternative approach offers the pragmatic model. This model was introduced by Jürgen Habermas into the so-called debate on technocracy in the 1960s. It goes back to John Dewey. There are different pragmatic models, but they all point to common features. These features are that they all highlight the interactive nature of the relation between science and policy. They all put attention to processes of mutual understanding and learning rather than maintaining the hierarchy and cognitive superiority of experts. They also try to bring back the politics in. They also raise questions about political power and authority. They try to open up the debates to questions of political delegation, representation, and legitimacy, rather than keeping problems away from the political world. Experts are not only supposed to improve decision-making, but also to empower the public and civil society and to enable them to deal with problems at stake. Accordingly, instrumental questions about impact and effectiveness have become combined with procedural issues like the legitimacy of processes and normative aspects such as fairness and equity. According to pragmatic models, what role is left for experts? According to these models, the relationship between science and policy is weak and heuristic rather than strong and deterministic as assumed by the linear model. From this perspective, the primary role of experts in politics is not to compel action, but to develop and to translate knowledge. Experts perform the function of a filter because they try to communicate political information needs to scientists, and they also try to transform scientific findings into relevant knowledge. Experts have to perform a particular task in this view. First, they are problem-oriented rather than curiosity-driven as pure science. They respond to information needs of decision makers and try to answer political relevant questions. Second, they are science-based, but they do not conduct research. Their purpose is to assess the state of already existing knowledge in order to answer policy-relevant problems. The American scientist Roger Pielke Jr. describes the role of advisors as honest brokers of policy alternatives. From his perspective, the task of experts is neither to substitute decision-making nor to prescribe political solution. The role of scientists is not to determine or to decide what choices we should take, but to indicate what the possible choices and possibility are. Experts act as honest brokers, and their job or their function is to opening up choices rather than to close them down to the one and only solution. Scholars like Andy Sterling and Roger Pielke also call for opening up debates about science policy. They try to encourage discussions about alternative representations of problems and about paths and alternative options not previously considered before. As I mentioned before, we cannot take the usability of knowledge for granted. In order to meet the information needs of decision makers, experts cannot constrain themselves on scientific facts only and claim to be a part of politics, to be value neutral. They need to address the policy-relevant implications of scientific findings and link them to the core political, social, and cultural problems at stake. So one of the major challenges for experts is then to combine rather precise statements of science with a set of more contested political interpretation of such knowledge. In other words, they have to make their hands dirty with the messy world of politics. Decision makers often need to know how decisions will affect their specific political jurisdictions and what type of intervention makes a difference over different timescale, at what cost, and to whose benefit. This means they want to have answers not only about ecological impacts and boundary, but also about winners and losers, cost and benefit, who pay, who pollutes, and things like that. In order to perform this task, we also need often a better understanding about social, economic, political, and cultural processes and conditions underlying decision-making and transformation processes. We have to take into account both sides, not only experts who produce assessment and expertise, but also to take into account potential users, target groups, and audiences. Participation is seen as one way to make expertise more relevant. Participation is supposed to increase the political relevance of expertise. It's also supposed to enable different stakeholders to bring their own knowledge about the implementation and other issues into the advisory process. And these processes and the ownership of expertise by stakeholders is supposed to enhance the legitimacy and acceptance of transformation-relevant policies. But it's also important to take into account the special nature of expert bodies. Expert bodies are hybrid bodies rather than purely scientific or political bodies. They are situated at the interface between science and politics. That means they are accountable at least to two very different communities, and they must maintain their credibility and trust with both sides. The scientists who make up its membership and who will provide their input to scientific advice, but also to different policy communities to which it provides input. And as a lot of cases show, more participation cannot substitute process of scientific assessment and quality control. Scientific quality and peer review remain the backbones of scientific expertise and a prerequisite of their authority. Situated at the interface between science and policy, expert bodies have to reconcile democratic value, such as the call for more participation, with the need of expert decision-making. They have to combine public demands for more accountability and participation with the requirement for scientific assessment and quality control. What is the added value of expert bodies or boundary organizations situated at the science policy interface? Because they are hybrid and they are situated between these worlds, they also offer a site to bring together legislators, technical experts, representatives of other areas of society, such as stakeholders, civil society, and so on. And they often represent the microcosm of society concerned. In other words, they are able to exchange and pool information and resources to integrate knowledge, judgments, and value, and thus to initiate interdisciplinary social-wide dialogues. But this exercise can only work if it's understood as a two-way exercise, taking different sides seriously, and if it's organized in a symmetrical and reciprocal way. We have also to take into account the consequences and the paradoxes of expertise in policy. There's one paradoxical feature, and this feature we can see in a lot of cases like climate change, nuclear power, or even when it comes to transformation policy. As experts begin to acquire greater epistemic and political authority, they can also move to the center of political and public attention. The IPCC, for instance, became victim of its own success. Even though, or rather precisely because, the IPCC was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize, it became a target for attacks and public scrutiny. Its authority could not longer be seen as given or taken for granted, but could easily be challenged. Paradoxically, from a political science perspective, the extent of politicization of expert bodies can be seen as an indicator of their epistemic and political authority. The epistemic and political authority can thus become an object of negotiation and political choice. That is, epistemic and political authority can become reflexive. Because expert bodies, if they are politically relevant and public visible, because they are exposed to public scrutiny, they are operating under the public microscope, they have also to adjust their procedures and governance structure in response to these novel challenges. Their performance is also dependent on how they are able to respond and to adapt. One of the challenges, due to their public visibility, is to respond to public demands for transparency and accountability. But trust is not just the function of information, as many scientists hope and believe. Telling people, hey, I'm expert, you need to trust me, is just no longer enough. People do not trust science, as a lot of case studies in the field of risk management show. They trust into institutions, persons, and processes that are responsible for dealing with risk as sake. What matters here is also the performance and the ways how experts react and respond to public scrutiny, rather than the content and the quality of science alone. As many studies in the field of risk assessment show, trust is also a function of the relation between experts and the public. It's very dependent on the willingness of experts to show why the public should believe experts, how and why and in which ways. for instance, expertise is produced, it's not to shield their working, but it's more about to make public how advisory bodies work. The growing demand for public accountability also requires new forms of interdisciplinary expert judgment, public engagement, and last but not least, quality control. As an alternative to top-down communication process based on the linear model and the so-called deficit model of science communication, pragmatic scholars promote a more distributed and participatory approach. These are approaches that engage scientists, governance, and the public in a shared process of mutual understanding and dialogue rather than trying to control the public outreach of expertise. Trust in expertise does not only require designing expert bodies to be more transparent and accountable to the public and to include the audience into the interpretation of scientific findings that are produced before. The linear model assumes a linear sequence. You have risk assessment, risk management, and then risk communication. But alternatives would suggest that it's also necessary to open up greater accountability for choices in organizing scientific advice. These are normative judgments and policy choices in setting criteria for legitimating scientific evidence, selecting expert, organizing review procedures, and last but not least, demarcating the mandate of scientific and political institutions. In other words, instead of being insulated from public scrutiny, many choices and priorities, such as what kind of information is relevant and should be funded, have to be accountable to public debate. There are a lot of case studies that show that transparency and accountability do not necessarily undermine, but on the contrary, contribute to both to improve the quality of the expertise, but also to ensure the legitimacy of the process. In the pragmatic model, the public is not reduced to an illiterate and passive resource, namely a passive recipient of authority information provided by scientific leaders. The public is also empowered to participate in science policy and thus enabled to solve problems at stake. But this is a very experimental process. There are no standardized procedures how to do such a project. In other words, we are pioneering on new uncharted terrain. What are the conclusions of my talk? First of all, as I mentioned before, the one-size model cannot work because the most appropriate ways to address information needs and challenge vary from case to case and are also very dependent on the particular context. In support of the transformation process, what roles are left for experts? Should they be pure scientists, shielded in the ivory tower? Should they be stealth advocate, advocating one policy? Or should they be honest brokers? What contribution in support to policy? Should experts compel certain decisions? Should they improve decision-making? Or should they empower decision-making? And how should experts act? Should they be neutral, a part of the political process, or should they engage, get in a dialogue with their expected user groups? There are a lot of open questions that need further consideration and research. How to deal with consequences, the side effects of expertise, such as the paradoxes of political and epistemic authority. One of the challenges is also to map concepts such as accountability and participation onto well-entrenched relations between expert policy and the public. And we have also to think about how to develop effective institutional arrangement to integrate expertise in a more effective way. And we have to ask again what knowledge is relevant to experts' engagement with transformation politics. Taking the insights of pragmatic models seriously, there are also alternatives moving beyond a utilitarian approach to problem solving. The new contract between science and society, as promoted by the WBGU, calls for much deeper exercises in reframing the very purpose. They relate not only to the way how problems are framed, but also to framework conditions, the way how we cope with problems. In this view, experts do not only provide solutions, but also encourage experiments in the sense of a common search and learning process between experts and their audiences. From a pragmatic view, this may include the promise of a new beginning, to be able to seize an initiative and do the unanticipated. This may be called the constitutional moment of politics, but also of science policy, as Sheila Chesanoff would frame it. At the same time, we also need to face real-life conditions and to be very pragmatic about limitations of such experiments, rather than to commit us to unachievable goals, such as the linear model does. We have also to develop criteria to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate critique and deliberative and non-deliberative forms of expertise. This is particularly the case when it comes to controversies such as on climate change, on nuclear power, on mad cow disease and so on, where we have a lot of forms of politicization of science that may have quite different impacts on expertise. And we have also to collect examples of good practices in that sense that we get role models that may motivate others to follow this kind of experiments and practices. Last but not least, we have also to think more about how to put these insights and experiences in a more operational mode, to think about how to open up or make these concepts and ideas more relevant to people, to actors who are involved in designing or who participate in real-life expertise and assessments. I was trying to show you a variety of models and choices that you have when it comes to evaluate the proper role and contributions of experts to policy making. Now it's up to you to make use of them and to apply it. Thank you for your attention, and as usual you will find questions for self-exercises at the end of this talk. Thank you.